On a cold morning in February 1554, a teenage girl stood at the scaffold, trembling but composed, her voice barely above a whisper. She recited the Lord's Prayer, then laid her head upon the block. But what the world saw that day was not just a beheading, it was the final chapter in one of the most chilling psychological betrayals in royal history. This is not simply a tale of politics or succession. It is a slow, meticulous unraveling of a young mind caught in a trap built by ambition, power, and fear. This is the tragic destruction of Lady Jane Grey. Section 1. The birth of upon 1537-1547. Lady Jane Grey was born in October 1537, a child of noble blood and ambitious lineage. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, making her a cousin to Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, each a player in the bloody chessboard of Tudor succession. Her parents, Lady Frances Brandon and Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, were not content with mere nobility. They saw in Jane a pathway to the throne, a fragile, brilliant child molded from birth for royal destiny she neither sought nor understood. Even as a child, Jane was no ordinary girl. Her intelligence was legendary. Fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and French, she devoured theology with the hunger of a scholar twice her age. Educated by the most esteemed Protestant tutors of the time, Jane's mind was honed like a blade, but not for war, for obedience, for control. Behind the pages of Cicero and Plato, there was a darker education at play. Jane was taught submission. Her mother, Lady Frances, ruled the household with iron discipline. Records and personal letters describe frequent beatings and emotional manipulations. Discipline, cloaked as moral instruction, Jane herself would later confide to a visitor, Roger Ascham, "When I am in presence of either father or mother I speak not but at commandment, I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened." This was the genesis of Jane's psychological ruin. The tower was not built in a day, and neither is a prisoner's mind. The walls began rising around her in childhood. Section 2. Ascension by force 1547-1553. When King Henry VIII died in 1547, the throne passed to his only son, Edward VI, a sickly boy. Edward ruled in name while Protestant nobles like the Duke of Somerset and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, pulled the strings. England tilted toward radical Protestantism, and Jane's parents saw opportunity. She was betrothed to Guildford Dudley, Northumberland's son, a marriage that would fuse to powerful houses. But Jane protested. She didn't want Guildford. She didn't want power. She wanted freedom. No one listened. On May 25, 1553, Jane was married at age 15. The marriage was more a coronation rehearsal than a union. Northumberland had begun plotting to place Jane on the throne in place of Edward's Catholic half-sister, Mary. It was a bold and dangerous gamble. And Jane, she was never asked. When Edward lay dying in June 1553, he signed a device for the succession naming Jane as heir. The crown was to bypass Mary and Elizabeth. The plan was shrouded in legality, but under it lay treason. Jane was brought to Syon House in early July. There, Northumberland and her parents presented her with the crown. She reportedly fainted. Upon waking, she wept bitterly, crying out that the throne was not hers to accept. But she was already a prisoner, trapped between obedience and damnation. Section 3. 9 Days of Terror, July 10, July 19, 1553. Jane entered the Tower of London not as a prisoner, but as queen. On July 10, 1553, she was proclaimed monarch throughout England. Trumpets sounded. Bells rang. The Tower gates opened. But behind the pageantry was panic. Mary Tudor had escaped and was rallying an army in East Anglia. The people did not cheer for Jane. They feared her, or rather, They feared the men behind her, Northumberland, Dudley, the Protestant nobles who were using her as a shield against Catholic restoration. Inside the Tower, Jane's horror only deepened. She was forced into queenly duties, surrounded by guards, advisors, and her increasingly demanding husband, Guildford. When she refused to name him king, he stormed out in fury. Her parents pressured her. Her in-laws whispered threats. Alone, she confided to her ladies that she feared she had become a sacrificial lamb. Outside, London began to stir. Crowds murmured Mary's name. Even Protestants hesitated to support a girl placed on the throne by intrigue. Northumberland's support collapsed. On July 19th, the council switched allegiance. Mary was proclaimed queen. Jane's reign, if it could be called that, lasted 9 days. That evening, Jane watched from the Tower window as crowds celebrated her cousin's victory. She was no longer queen. She was now a traitor. Section 4. The real prison begins July 1553, February 1554. The Tower changed. Guards no longer saluted. Her clothes were stripped of royal ornament. Jane was moved from the Queen's apartments to a lesser chamber. Her husband was imprisoned in another part of the fortress. They would never meet again. It is here, during those long months of uncertain fate, that the true psychological destruction unfolded. She was 16. She was alone. Every sound outside her door could signal death. She was interrogated, pushed to confess her crimes. But what was her crime? Being born, obeying her parents. At first, Queen Mary showed mercy. She had no wish to kill her cousin. Jane was allowed books, a few loyal ladies, even correspondence. But it was mercy soaked in dread. Jane's letters from this time reveal a girl suspended in time. Her days filled with prayer, with writing, with desperate self-examination. She began composing treatises defending Protestant faith, texts so mature in theology that scholars still debate how such a young girl could possess such insight. But these were not merely academic works. They were her way of surviving. The Tower had become her monastery, the scaffold, her altar. Her writings from this period contain chilling signs of psychological collapse wrapped in religious serenity. She no longer spoke of escape or pardon. She began to view death as a release. In one letter, she wrote, "I am assured that though my body must perish, yet my soul shall find rest. Death is not the end, but the beginning of life. This is not hope. It is surrender." Section 5. The final blow. C. Wyatt's rebellion, January-February 1554. For months, Jane remained in limbo, neither condemned nor freed. But then came the final betrayal. In January 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion against Queen Mary, protesting her planned marriage to Philip of Spain. Protestants feared England would become a Spanish puppet, and many saw Jane as a preferable monarch. Jane knew nothing of the plot, but it did not matter. Her name was enough. As Wyatt's rebellion faltered, Mary saw an opportunity to send a message. Treason would not be tolerated. Blood would be spilled to ensure peace. On February 12, 1554, Jane was informed she would die the next morning. She spent that final night writing to her sister, Catherine, "Live still to die, that by death you may purchase eternal life. Learn to die. Deny the world and ever say with St. Paul, I desire to be dissolved and to be with Christ." These are not the words of a girl facing death. They are the words of someone who had been dying for months. The Tower had already killed her slowly, methodically. The axe was merely the final act. Section 6. The final morning. See February 12, 1554. The morning of her execution was unusually cold. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, dusting the Tower courtyard in a pale, silent shroud like a stage prepared for tragedy. Lady Jane Grey rose early, dressed in black, her face pale but composed. She clutched a small prayer book, the only item she would take to the scaffold. as she was led from her cell. Tower officials noted that she did not weep, nor resist. One eyewitness later wrote that she walked as one going to a wedding, not to her death. The Tower Green was quiet, surrounded by a small group of courtiers, guards, and clergy. The crowd was minimal, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of fear. This was not a traitor meeting justice. This was a sacrificial offering. Guildford Dudley had been executed just hours earlier. Jane had not been allowed to see him, though she witnessed his remains carried past her window, blood dripping from the cloth that wrapped his lifeless head. And yet, she walked. When she reached the scaffold, Jane delivered a short speech measured, eloquent, and heartbreaking. "Good people, I am come hither to die. I am a Christian woman and do look to be saved by no other means, but only by the mercy of God and the blood of His only Son Jesus Christ." She knelt. The blindfold was tied. Then she faltered, unable to find the block with her hands. She cried out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A trembling hand guided her. She laid down her head, and the axe fell. She was 16. Section 7. Aftermath. See the quiet echo of horror. The death of Lady Jane Grey did not inspire national mourning. There was no funeral procession, no mourning banners across the city. Her body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincoli inside the Tower, unmarked, unnamed for centuries. To most of England, she had been little more than a whisper, a 9-day queen, a cautionary tale. The government spun her death as necessary justice. Queen Mary, despite her personal reluctance, had made her statement. But within elite circles and Protestant households, something else began to grow. A quiet horror. Not rage, not rebellion. Grief. Writings from the period began to circulate clandestinely at first. Letters, poems, and accounts that described Jane not as a usurper, but as a martyr. Her piety, her calm, her intellect, her youth. Even Mary's allies found the execution troubling. The Archbishop of York later confided that he had hoped God would have moved the Queen to mercy. But the Tower had already become legend, and so had the girl who died there. Section 8. The creation of a martyr. In the decades after her death, Jane Grey's image was transformed. Protestant writers, especially those in exile during Mary's reign, seized upon her story. In John Fox's Acts and Monuments, better known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, Jane is portrayed as a pure and brilliant victim, a Protestant saint destroyed by Catholic tyranny. Her letters and prayers were reproduced. Her death was recounted in vivid detail. The Protestant Reformation found in her a perfect symbol. Young, intelligent, devout, and innocent. A girl who had everything stripped from her but retained her faith. Fox's work would go on to shape English Protestant identity for centuries. And Jane, barely known in her lifetime, became an icon. Paintings were commissioned, sermons preached. Her prayer book became a treasured relic, passed from hand to hand like sacred scripture. But even as her legacy grew, the truth of her psychological torment was slowly erased. History remembered her piety. It forgot her fear. Section 9. The Tower as a psychological weapon. To understand Lady Jane Grey's fate is to understand the Tower of London not just as a prison, but as a machine, a psychological weapon. Over centuries, the Tower had developed into more than a fortress. It was a symbol of state power, designed not merely to hold bodies, but to break minds. The architecture was intentional. Prisoners were separated, silenced, observed. Time passed without rhythm or certainty. Executions were staged as theater. Hope was given and then removed. Every element was calculated to reduce a person's sense of control, to make obedience seem like the only option, to make surrender seem holy. Jane's letters from the Tower show clear signs of trauma response. Emotional numbing, spiritual rationalization, identity diffusion. Her early protests vanished. In their place came doctrine, humility, Detachment from life itself. She was not killed in a single day. She was erased piece by piece.